The unexpected encounter. It was an ordinary evening for Jake. He was walking home through the quiet streets of his small town, the sun just beginning to set behind the tall buildings. The streets were empty, and all he could hear was the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. Jake liked it this way. Peaceful, calm, no one to bother him. But today, something felt different. There was a strange stillness in the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. As Jake turned the corner near the alleyway that led to his house, he heard it. A low, almost inaudible sound. It was like a soft whimper, a cry for help. Jake stopped in his tracks, heart racing. He looked around but saw nothing. The streetlights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. The sound came again, louder this time. He hesitated. Should he investigate or just ignore it? It could be nothing, right? Maybe a stray animal or someone in trouble. But his curiosity got the better of him, and slowly he walked toward the sound. The alley was dark, the shadows swallowing up most of the light. He could barely see anything, but he knew something was there. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, in pain. Jake moved forward cautiously, his shoes clicking softly on the pavement. And then he saw her, a figure hunched on the ground, her back to him. She was trembling, her clothes torn and dirty. Her hair, if you could even call it hair, was long and silvery, flowing in strange, unnatural ways. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with an eerie blue glow. But what really caught Jake's attention were her eyes. They were huge, round, and full of fear. She looked human, but there was something else about her, something alien. Jake took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. Was she an alien? The thought flashed through his mind, but it didn't seem real. He had seen sci-fi movies, sure, but this wasn't a movie. This was happening right in front of him. The woman turned her head slowly, as if she had sensed his presence. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was deafening. Her gaze was filled with desperation, and Jake felt an odd pull in his chest. This wasn't some alien invader. This was someone in need. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had no idea who, or what, this woman was, but the look in her eyes made it impossible for him to ignore her. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. He took a step closer, trying to keep his distance, but also wanting to offer some comfort. The woman winced, as if the effort to speak had caused her pain. I'm lost," she said weakly. "I need food, water, shelter. Please, help me." Jake knelt down beside her, looking at her closely. She looked fragile, as if she hadn't eaten or slept in days. Her body was thin, and her skin had a sickly pallor to it. She could barely hold her head up. There was no way she had just wandered into this alley on her own. Something had happened to her, something terrible. For a moment, Jake froze. What if this was some kind of trap? What if helping her was a mistake? But he couldn't just leave her here. He had to do something. "Where did you come from?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. He needed to know more. The woman's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head slowly. I don't know. My ship crashed. I'm alone. Please." Her voice cracked, and she looked away, as if the memory of whatever happened to her was too much to bear. Jake felt his heart ache. He had no idea what she was talking about. Ship? Alien? It all sounded insane. But looking at her, he knew one thing for sure. She needed help. Okay, I'll help you," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. "But you have to come with me. I can't leave you here." The woman's eyes brightened, just a little. She nodded weakly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Jake gently helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she leaned against him. Her body felt cold and fragile, like a leaf in the wind. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jake wasn't sure what he was getting into, but one thing was certain: this was just the beginning. He had no idea who or what this woman was, or what kind of trouble she was in, but something told him that his life was about to change forever. He led her down the dark alley, back toward his house. The quiet evening was shattered by the strange sound of her footsteps, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Something wasn't right. What had happened to this woman? And what did she mean by "my ship crashed"? Jake had 1,000 questions, but for now, all that mattered was getting her to safety. Little did he know, the road ahead would be much more dangerous than he could ever imagine. And this strange encounter would be the spark that changed everything. A desperate plea for help. Jake helped the alien woman into his house as quickly as he could, locking the door behind them. His mind raced with questions, but there was no time to ask them now. Her condition was worsening by the minute. She could barely stand on her own, and her breath was shallow, like she was struggling to keep herself alive. Jake had seen people in bad shape before, but nothing like this. He led her to his living room, where the couch was, and gently helped her sit down. The woman collapsed with a sigh of relief, her trembling hands clutching the edge of the cushion. Her eyes closed briefly, as if she was finally able to rest, but when she opened them again, the desperation was still there. Jake noticed the way her eyes flickered nervously, like she was constantly on the lookout for something. Someone, maybe. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, kneeling in front of her. "Can I get you some water? Some food?" The woman's lips parted, but it took a moment for her to speak. She struggled to form the words, her voice raspy and weak. "Food, water, please. I need help." Jake nodded, rushing to the kitchen. He returned quickly with a glass of water and some bread. He handed both to her, and she took them eagerly, drinking as though she hadn't had anything to drink in days. She devoured the bread, her hands trembling as she ate. Jake watched, feeling a mixture of concern and confusion. What had happened to her? Where had she come from? "Where are you from?" Jake asked, his voice quiet but full of curiosity. The woman's eyes met his again, and for a moment, she didn't speak. She looked away, her face clouded with sorrow. Jake could see that whatever had happened to her was something painful, something she didn't want to talk about. She began, pausing as if the words were difficult for her. "I'm from another world, far from here. My people, we were peaceful. We wanted to live in harmony with the universe. But my planet." She faltered, her eyes filled with deep sadness. "My planet was destroyed. My enemies, they attacked us. I was the only one to escape. I had to run." Jake sat down beside her, his mind reeling from the words she spoke. She was from another world. How could that be possible? Everything she said sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, but her pain was real. Her fear was real. "What happened to your enemies?" Jake asked, his voice soft. "Why are they after you?" The woman hesitated again, her eyes distant as if the memories were too painful to revisit. "They are powerful. They want to control the galaxy. They destroy anyone who stands in their way. They found out I escaped, and now they're hunting me. They won't stop until they find me. I can't go back. I can't let them capture me. Please, help me." Jake's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It sounded like something out of a movie, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to ignore. She was terrified, and she had no one else. There was no one else who could help her. "I don't know how I can help you," Jake admitted, his voice full of uncertainty. I'm just a regular guy. I don't know how to fight off enemies from another planet." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to survive. I just want to be safe. I can't stay here for long. They'll find me eventually. I can't hide forever." Jake felt a wave of compassion flood over him. He had never been faced with anything like this before, but one thing was clear: He couldn't just leave her to face this alone. She was in danger, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand, she was asking him for help. He didn't know how he could protect her, but he knew he had to try. "I'll help you," Jake said, his voice firm. "I don't know how, but I'll figure it out. You're not alone. I'm not going to let them get you." The woman's face softened as she looked at him, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you so much." Jake sat beside her for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. His life, which had always been so simple, so predictable, was now turned upside down. A part of him wanted to run, to forget this entire encounter ever happened, but another part of him, the part that couldn't stand to see someone in pain, was determined to do whatever he could to help. But the reality was, Jake had no idea what he was getting into. Who were her enemies? How could he protect her from something so out of this world? As Jake thought about these questions, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now a part of something much bigger than himself. The alien woman, who had come to him in her time of need, was about to change everything. He just didn't know how yet, but he would soon. He had to. The woman leaned back, her body exhausted, but her mind still racing. She was grateful for Jake's help, but she knew the danger was far from over. Her enemies were relentless, and if they came looking for her, Jake would be in danger too. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't let anyone else get hurt because of her. "Please, be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They will come for you too." Jake nodded, trying to reassure her, but deep inside, he knew that things were only beginning. Whatever happened next, his life, and her life, would never be the same. The decision to hide her. The next few days felt like a blur to Jake. He had never been one for drama or excitement. His life had always been quiet, predictable. He worked a regular job at a small office downtown, and in his spare time, he enjoyed simple things, reading, jogging, or watching movies. But now, everything was different. The alien woman, he still didn't know her name, was staying in his small, two-bedroom house. Jake had set up a makeshift bed for her in the guest room. It wasn't much, but it was better than the cold, dark alley where he had found her. Over the past couple of days, she had slowly recovered. Her strength was returning, although she still looked fragile and pale, and her once glowing skin had a slightly healthier color to it. But even as her physical condition improved, her mind seemed to remain on edge. She would often glance nervously out the window, as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. Jake had tried asking her more questions, but she remained guarded. She would answer, but always with hesitation, as though she was afraid of saying too much. Her past was a mystery, and the more Jake learned, the more he realized how little he actually knew. One thing was clear, though. This woman was in danger, and it wasn't just from her enemies. Jake had begun to understand that helping her wasn't just a choice for him. It was becoming a responsibility, a duty he couldn't ignore. By the fourth day, Jake had a decision to make. Should he continue to hide her in his home, keep her safe from the world, or should he call for help? There were so many unknowns, her enemies, her powers, the strange things she had hinted at. He didn't know who to trust, or what kind of trouble he might be bringing onto himself. Sitting in his living room one evening, Jake stared at the woman across from him, who was seated on the couch, her eyes distant. She had been quiet for hours. Too quiet. Jake cleared his throat, trying to start a conversation. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, watching her closely. "You've been acting different, like you're not really here." The woman's eyes slowly shifted to meet his, and for a moment, he could see the faintest flicker of pain behind them. She looked tired, so tired. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice soft and hesitant. I don't feel safe. I'm always watching, waiting. I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Jake's heart ached for her. He could see the weight of her words, the fear that clung to her every movement. It was clear she was running from something. Something terrible. I don't want to put you in danger, Jake said, his voice low. But hiding here forever might not be the answer. You need to be somewhere safer, somewhere no one can find you. The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she looked away. No one can protect me. Not forever. Not even here. My enemies, they won't stop until they find me. I don't want to drag you into this. You don't deserve this. Jake leaned forward, his hand resting on the table between them. He had to make her understand. I know you're scared, he said gently, but you can't keep running forever. You need help, and I don't think running is going to work for much longer. They'll find you, and they'll find me too if we don't do something. The woman's face twisted in agony, but she remained silent, staring down at her hands. She knew Jake was right, but she didn't want to accept it. She didn't want him involved in her fight. Jake took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he was getting into, but his decision was made. He was going to protect her, no matter the cost. Listen, Jake began, his voice firm but kind. I don't know how we're going to do this, but we'll figure it out. I can't just leave you here, afraid all the time. We'll make a plan, find a way to get you the help you need. You're not alone anymore. The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and hope. For a brief moment, she seemed to soften, as if she wanted to believe in what he was saying. You would do that? She asked quietly, her voice trembling. You would help me, even though you don't know who I am. What I am. Jake nodded without hesitation. I don't need to know everything about you to know that you need help, and I'm not going to turn my back on you now. There was a long pause as the woman processed his words. Jake could see her internal struggle. She had been alone for so long, and the thought of trusting someone again was terrifying. But for the first time since he had met her, she seemed to relax, just a little. I don't know what to say, she whispered, looking down. I've never had anyone to trust before. Not like this. Not in my life. Jake smiled gently. You don't have to say anything. Just trust me to help. We'll figure it out together. The room was filled with silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time, Jake felt like they were on the same page. He wasn't just helping her out of guilt or obligation anymore. He genuinely wanted to help, to protect her. That night, as they sat together in the dim light of the living room, Jake felt a sense of purpose growing within him. He knew he wasn't just protecting some stranger anymore. She was more than that. She was someone who had lost everything, her home, her people, her safety, and was now looking to him for something he didn't know if he could provide. But he would try, no matter what. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it. For the first time in a long while, Jake wasn't just living his ordinary, quiet life. He was part of something bigger now, something that was about to change everything. And he couldn't go back. The alien story. The night was quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional creak of the house settling. The small living room was dim, illuminated only by the flickering light from the television screen. Jake sat on the couch, his legs stretched out, his mind filled with the events of the past few days. His life had been turned upside down since that fateful night when he found her in the alley. An alien woman, desperate, weak, and full of fear. But despite the confusion, despite the mystery, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. He needed answers, and he could tell she needed to share her story. The woman, whom Jake still didn't know the name of, had been quiet all evening, sitting by the window and watching the night sky. Her eyes were distant, as if her thoughts were far away, trapped in a place Jake couldn't reach. He had been patient with her, not pushing too hard, but now, as the silence stretched on, he felt the need to understand her better, to know more about the woman he had decided to protect. "Hey," Jake said softly, breaking the stillness. "I know you've been through a lot. You don't have to tell me everything, but I want to know more about you. About where you come from." The woman's gaze shifted slowly from the window to him. There was hesitation in her eyes, but also a quiet sadness. For a moment, Jake thought she might refuse, but then she sighed deeply and began to speak. It's hard to explain," she began, her voice still faint, but gaining strength. "But I will try." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts, then continued. "I'm not from here. Not from Earth. My people, we come from a planet called Zeran. It's a beautiful place, far from here. A planet of peace. We live for generations in harmony, working with nature, studying the stars. We were different. Our society was based on knowledge, growth, and exploration. We didn't fight wars or conquer others. We believed in the power of unity, the strength that comes from understanding each other." Jake listened intently, unable to tear his eyes away from her as she spoke. Her words painted a picture of a world so different from his own, one that seemed almost too good to be true. A place where peace reigned, where people lived in harmony. It was hard to imagine such a world in the midst of everything that was happening. "But," Jake asked gently, "what happened to it? What happened to your people?" The woman's face tightened, and her eyes seemed to darken with a memory that haunted her. She looked away, staring out the window again, as if the night sky might offer some comfort. "We were attacked," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A few years ago, our peaceful existence was shattered. A race, they were called the Kroloth. They came from a distant system, and they wanted our resources. They didn't care about peace or harmony. They only wanted control." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories of intergalactic wars, of powerful alien races, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it, who had experienced the destruction firsthand, made it all too real. He could hear the pain in her voice, the trauma she carried with her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That must have been horrible." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It was," she whispered. "They didn't just attack our cities or our people. They destroyed everything. They wiped out entire cities in a single night. They didn't care about the innocents, the old, the children. They killed them all. My people fought back, but we were no match for them. They had advanced weapons, technology far beyond what we could defend ourselves with. We had nothing left to fight with, except our will to survive." She paused again, her fingers twitching nervously. Jake could see how hard it was for her to talk about this. It was a painful memory, one she probably hadn't shared with anyone else in a long time. "How did you escape?" Jake asked, his voice full of sympathy. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to lose everything. "I was one of the last to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to leave my family behind. I had no choice. The Kroloth were closing in, and we had a ship ready to go, but there wasn't enough time for everyone to escape. I had to leave them. I promised I'd come back for them, but I never could. The ship I was on was damaged in the attack. I ended up crash landing here on Earth. I don't even know if anyone else survived." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. Her story was heartbreaking, and yet there was so much more to it. This wasn't just some random alien. She was a survivor, someone who had seen her entire world torn apart. She was carrying the weight of an entire planet on her shoulders. "Are you the only one left?" Jake asked, his voice soft. The woman nodded slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow. "As far as I know, yes. I've been running ever since. The Kroloth, they never stopped searching for me. They want me dead, because I know something important. I don't know why, but I can't let them get their hands on it." Jake leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you know? What's so important that they're willing to kill for it?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She lowered her voice, as though afraid someone might overhear. "There's an artifact, a powerful one. It holds the key to stopping the Kroloth, to defeating them once and for all. But it's hidden, and only a few of us knew where it was. I was one of the ones entrusted with that knowledge. The Kraloth will stop at nothing to find it. They think if they get their hands on it, they'll be unstoppable. Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine. And you're the only one who knows where it is. The woman nodded grimly. Yes, but it's not safe. They'll come for me. And they'll come for you too. If they think I'm the key to finding the artifact, they won't stop. They'll destroy anything in their path. Jake's mind was racing. He had no idea how to help her find this artifact, or how to stop the Kraloth. But one thing was certain. He was in deeper than he ever thought possible. His life, his quiet, peaceful life, had changed in an instant. And now he was part of something much bigger. I don't know how we can stop them, Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his head. But I'm not going to let them hurt you. We'll figure it out. The woman's gaze softened, her face a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for believing in me. But we don't have much time. The Kraloth are always watching. Jake nodded. There was no going back now. Whatever came next, he would face it, head on, with the woman who had come to him for help. Together, they would face the unknown, no matter the cost. The first attack. Jake hadn't realized how much his life had changed until the quiet moments started to feel like they were slipping away. After hearing the alien woman's story, he understood the stakes, understood that protecting her was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But he had made a decision, and he wasn't about to back out now. He was committed to helping her, to keeping her safe, even if it meant risking everything. But no matter how much he tried to prepare himself, he wasn't ready for what came next. It was late, almost midnight, when Jake first noticed something was wrong. He had been sitting at his kitchen table, reviewing some old paperwork from work, trying to keep his mind distracted. But something was off. A strange feeling tugged at the back of his mind, like a subtle unease that he couldn't shake. He'd grown used to the silence in his house, but tonight it felt heavier, more oppressive. He glanced at the clock. His mind wandered to the woman, still in the living room, looking out the window. He had started to notice that she spent a lot of time staring into the night, as if waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone. Jake had asked her about it, but she always deflected, saying it was just part of the fear she carried with her. But tonight, Jake felt it too, the strange, heavy presence that seemed to hang in the air. Without thinking, he stood up from the table and walked into the living room, where she sat, still and quiet, her eyes focused on the darkened street outside. When she heard him approach, she turned, her expression tense, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and mourning. "Something's coming," she said, her voice a sharp whisper. Jake froze. The hairs on his neck stood up. "What do you mean?" The woman's voice trembled. "They found us." Before Jake could react, the silence of the night was shattered by a loud crash from outside. The windows rattled with the force of the impact, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. He rushed to the door, but before he could reach the lock, there was another sound. This one closer, sharper. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving toward the house. Jake's pulse quickened. The woman was already at the window, peering through the blinds with a look of pure terror. "They're here," she whispered. "They know I'm here." He rushed to her side. "Who are they? What do we do?" "The Kraloth," she gasped. "They found me. You have to hide. You can't let them find you." Jake's mind raced. He had no idea what he was supposed to do. The idea of running or hiding didn't seem possible. It was already too late. From the way she spoke, he could feel the weight of her fear. It was real, and it was closing in. "Where are they?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the growing panic in his chest. She looked at him, her eyes wide. "They're already here. They're surrounding the house." Suddenly, the door crashed open, and Jake's heart jumped into his throat. A tall figure stepped into the room, silhouetted against the dim light from the street. The alien was tall, much taller than Jake, with skin like polished metal, gleaming in the light from the street lamps. Its eyes were dark, empty voids, reflecting nothing but cold menace. The figure's armor was sleek and frightening, covering its body from head to toe, leaving no visible hint of humanity, if it had ever been human at all. Jake froze, panic clawing at his chest. He had seen creatures like this in movies, but nothing could have prepared him for the terror of seeing one in his own home. This wasn't fiction. This was real, and it was standing right in front of him. The alien's voice was low, mechanical, as if it was speaking through some kind of translator. "We know you are here," it said, its voice vibrating through the room. "You cannot hide. You cannot escape." The woman gasped, stepping back, her eyes wide with recognition. "Krylov," she whispered under her breath. "You found me." Jake didn't know what to do. He wanted to fight, to defend her, but he didn't have any weapons. He was just an ordinary guy, caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. And here, standing in front of him, was a ruthless enemy that wanted nothing more than to capture her and destroy them both. The Krylov soldier took a step forward, its weapon raised. It didn't need to say another word. Its cold, emotionless eyes told Jake everything he needed to know. It wasn't here for negotiation. It was here for destruction. But just as the Krylov soldier advanced, the woman's eyes flared with a bright, almost blinding light. She raised her hand, and the air around them seemed to ripple. A shield of energy, translucent and shimmering, formed around them. Jake gasped, stepping back as the force field expanded, pushing the soldier away. "What the hell?" Jake breathed, staring at her in disbelief. He had seen her do things before, small things, like healing quickly or sensing his movements. But this was different. The shield of energy was powerful, something beyond human understanding. The alien soldier recoiled in surprise, taking a step back. "You can't protect him forever," the Krylov soldier growled. "He will die with you." But the woman didn't flinch. "You won't touch him," she said, her voice cold and determined. She was no longer the broken, scared woman she had been when Jake found her. She was a warrior, one who had been forced to run and hide for too long. For a moment, the two locked eyes, Jake, still frozen, and the alien, who was clearly assessing the situation. The standoff seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Then, with a growl of frustration, the Krylov soldier turned its back and walked toward the door. It paused, as if considering whether to finish the job, but then it simply stepped out into the night, disappearing into the shadows. Jake stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence that followed felt deafening. He turned to the woman, who was still standing with her hand raised, the energy field still humming faintly around them. Her face was pale, but there was a fire in her eyes. "That was too close," Jake said, his voice shaky. She nodded, lowering her hand. "I know. They've never been this close before. They're learning. They're adapting." Jake swallowed hard, trying to process everything that had just happened. He had no idea what he was dealing with, but he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The Krylov were after her, and they weren't going to stop. Jake and the woman were in the fight of their lives, and if they didn't act fast, there might not be a second chance. "We can't stay here," Jake said, his mind already racing ahead. "They'll be back." "I know," she replied, her voice grim. "And next time, they won't just send one." The race to the artifact. The next few days felt like a blur, but one thing was clear. Jake and the alien woman, whom he had finally learned was named Lyra, had no time to waste. The Krylov were closing in, and every minute they spent waiting made it that much harder to stay hidden. After their narrow escape from the first attack, the tension in the air was suffocating. Lyra, though seemingly calm, was on edge, constantly scanning the horizon and watching the skies. Jake couldn't help but wonder how many times she had run from danger before, how many times she had been forced to leave everything behind. Lyra had explained that there was only one way to stop the Krylov, the artifact, but getting to it was no simple task. The artifact, an ancient relic hidden deep within the earth, had the power to turn the tide in their favor. It was the key to unlocking a weapon strong enough to defeat the Krelov once and for all. But it wasn't just the artifact they had to worry about. Getting to it would require them to navigate through some of the most dangerous terrain imaginable, and they weren't the only ones searching for it. The Krelov, Lyra explained, were relentless. They had eyes everywhere, tracking her every move. They were also aware of the artifact's power, and they would stop at nothing to seize it. The stakes had never been higher, and the closer they got to the artifact, the more dangerous it would become. Every step they took would be a race against time, and against the Krelov. "We can't waste any more time," Lyra said one night, as they sat together in the living room, a map of the area spread out before them. "The Krelov are going to find us again. We need to move now." Jake nodded, though his mind was racing. How was he supposed to help her? He had no experience with anything like this, no knowledge of ancient artifacts, no idea how to navigate hidden tombs or underground caverns. He was a regular guy, thrust into a situation that seemed more like a bad dream than reality. But one thing was for sure, he couldn't let her go alone. Not after everything they had been through. "I'm with you," Jake said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to help you." Lyra looked at him, her eyes softening just a bit. "I don't want to drag you into this," she said. "This isn't your fight." Jake shook his head. "It is now. You're not alone in this. If we're going to do this, we do it together." She seemed to think for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We need to go to the site, the one where the artifact is hidden. But it's not going to be easy to get there. The Krelov know about it. They'll be watching." The plan was simple, but fraught with danger. The artifact was located in an ancient underground temple, hidden deep within a forest in a remote part of the country. Lyra had been there once, but it had been years, and the Krelov had made it nearly impossible to return. The temple was buried beneath layers of rock and earth, and only a few people knew the exact location. But it wasn't just the Krelov they had to worry about. The temple was filled with traps, puzzles, and hidden dangers designed to protect the artifact from anyone who might try to take it. Jake and Lyra packed their supplies and made their way out of the city the next morning, driving toward the forest. The farther they went, the more anxious Jake became. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The streets were empty, but he kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the gleaming eyes of the Krelov following them. Every time a car passed, his heart raced, but there was no turning back now. By the time they reached the outskirts of the forest, the sun was beginning to set. The dense trees cast long shadows over the road, and the air grew cooler with every passing minute. Lyra led the way, her eyes scanning the forest around them with practiced precision. Jake followed close behind, trying to ignore the feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach. "Stay close," Lyra warned, her voice low and tense. "We're almost there, but we have to be careful. The Krelov might be tracking us." Jake nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of the small knife he had brought with him. It was barely more than a tool, but it made him feel a little better. They walked through the trees in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustling in the branches above them. After what felt like hours, they arrived at the entrance to the temple, a massive stone doorway hidden among the thick trees. The stone was old, covered in moss and vines, but the carvings on the door were still visible. Symbols that were foreign to Jake, but clearly important. Lyra stepped forward, tracing the symbols with her fingers. "This is it," she said quietly, her voice filled with awe. The entrance to the temple. Jake looked around nervously. It felt like the air had shifted, like something was waiting just beyond the trees. "How do we get inside?" Lyra knelt in front of the door, pressing her hand against the stone. Slowly, the door began to shift, moving inward with a deep rumbling sound. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the stone door slid open, revealing a dark, narrow passage leading deep underground. Lyra took a deep breath and turned to Jake. "This is it. Once we go in, There's no turning back. Jake swallowed hard, but he nodded. I'm ready. They stepped into the darkness, the heavy stone doors sliding shut behind them with a thud. As they descended into the depths of the temple, the atmosphere grew colder, and the air grew thick with dust and ancient power. The walls were lined with carvings, just like the door, and the path ahead was narrow and winding, leading them deeper into the heart of the earth. The further they went, the more oppressive the silence became. The only sound was their footsteps, echoing off the stone walls. Jake felt the weight of the place pressing down on him, as though the very ground beneath them was alive with secrets. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of dangers awaited them down here. Lyra stopped suddenly, holding up her hand. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. She was listening, waiting for something. We're not alone, she whispered. They know we're here. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to ask who they were. He already knew. The Kreloth were coming. And now, the race to the artifact wasn't just a race against time. It was a race for survival. The final showdown. The walls of the temple seemed to close in around Jake as he and Lyra made their way deeper into the labyrinth of stone and darkness. Every turn they took felt like it might be their last, every footstep echoing in the silence like a warning. The air grew thicker with each step, charged with an energy Jake couldn't understand but could feel deep in his bones. The temple was ancient, its secrets buried in the very foundation of the earth. And now, after everything they had been through, it had come down to this. As they approached what seemed to be the heart of the temple, a vast chamber lit only by the faint glow of strange, glowing crystals embedded in the walls, Jake could feel it. Something was waiting. Something dangerous. Lyra, too, seemed to sense it, her pace slowing as her hand instinctively reached for the small device she carried, an ancient relic passed down through her people. It was their only hope of unlocking the power of the artifact. But before they could move any closer, the ground trembled beneath them, sending a deep, resonant hum through the stone. Jake's heart leaped into his throat. The Kreloth had found them again. They weren't just hunting them. They were closing in fast. Stay behind me, Lyra said sharply, her voice low and commanding. She placed her hand on his arm, urging him to stay close. They're here. Jake could hear the sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway. The Kreloth soldiers were approaching, their boots scraping against the stone floor with a mechanical rhythm. He could see the outlines of their dark, imposing figures through the shadows, their armor glinting faintly in the dim light. There were at least 3 of them, maybe more. They were not just searching for the artifact anymore. They were hunting them. Lyra's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her body tense with anticipation. She activated the relic, and a low hum filled the air. The glowing symbols on her device began to shift, illuminating the room with a pale blue light. The temple seemed to respond to it, the ancient machinery within the stone walls coming to life. But even as the artifact's power began to pulse, Lyra's face twisted with concern. They're too close, she murmured. We need to move quickly. Suddenly, one of the Kreloth soldiers emerged from the shadows, towering over them with its terrifying, impassive stare. The creature raised its weapon, a sleek, plasma-infused blade, its energy humming with lethal intent. Without a second's hesitation, Lyra unleashed a blast of energy from her device, sending a shockwave through the room. The soldier staggered back, temporarily stunned by the force of the blast. Jake couldn't just stand there. He had to do something. Grabbing the small knife he had brought with him, he lunged forward, hoping to buy them a few precious moments. But before he could get any closer, another Kreloth soldier stepped forward, slamming him against the wall with brutal force. The impact knocked the breath out of him, and he crumpled to the ground, vision spinning. Jake! Lyra shouted, her voice frantic as she turned to him, but there was no time. The third soldier had already closed in on her. In that split second, Lyra's eyes blazed with a fierce intensity. She wasn't just a frightened survivor anymore. She was a warrior, a force of nature that refused to bow down. With a scream of fury, she channeled all her energy into the relic, sending a powerful pulse of light straight into the heart of the temple. The walls shook, and the ground beneath their feet cracked open, revealing an ancient mechanism hidden beneath the stone. The Krelloth soldiers recoiled, their vision temporarily blinded by the brilliance of the energy. In that moment of weakness, Jake grabbed the knife from the ground, his body aching but determined to fight. He rushed toward the soldier closest to Lyra, plunging the blade into the alien's side. The creature screeched, its eyes wide with shock, before it collapsed in a heap. But there was no time to celebrate. The Krelloth were relentless, and more were already arriving. The chamber was quickly becoming a battleground, a chaotic whirlwind of energy blasts, alien soldiers, and the pulsing glow of the artifact. Jake and Lyra moved as one, instinctively knowing each other's next move. Lyra's energy blasts continued to fly, knocking back the soldiers who were trying to close in on them. But despite their best efforts, it was clear that they were outnumbered. More Krelloth soldiers were advancing, their dark forms emerging from the shadows like predators closing in on their prey. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't let her die. He couldn't let this be the end. He had promised to protect her. And somehow, he was going to do it. With a roar, Jake launched himself at the nearest Krelloth, his body moving purely on adrenaline. He dodged the alien's attacks, his movements sharp and fast. He stabbed at the soldier, narrowly avoiding its weapon, but the creature was quick. It swung its blade with precision, slashing at Jake's side. The pain was instant, searing through his body. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Lyra, seeing him struggle, turned her attention to him, her eyes filled with desperation. Jake, get to the artifact. Now. She was right. They had no chance of winning this fight if they didn't unlock the artifact's power. With a final burst of energy, she blasted the remaining Krelloth soldiers back, creating a brief opening. Jake didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the stone pedestal where the artifact rested, its ancient design glowing with a fierce intensity. As he approached, the artifact pulsed with energy, reacting to his presence. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift, the ancient power resonating in his bones. Jake placed his hands on the artifact, feeling the surge of energy flood through him. The power was overwhelming, but it was also guiding him, showing him what to do. With a single motion, Jake activated the artifact. The temple shook violently, and the entire chamber was flooded with blinding light. The Krelloth soldiers screeched in agony as the energy blast shot out, engulfing them in a wave of pure power. The light continued to radiate outward, expanding through the temple and beyond. In the chaos, Jake felt the weight of the moment. He was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was part of something much bigger, a fight for the future, for a chance at redemption. The Krelloth had underestimated humanity, and now they would pay the price. As the dust settled, Jake stood there, panting, his body bruised and bloodied. Lyra was beside him, her face pale but alive. Together, they had won. The Krelloth were defeated for now. The artifact, the key to the galaxy's future, lay safely in their hands. But Jake knew this wasn't the end. The Krelloth were a powerful enemy, and they would return. There was still much to do, and the war was far from over. But for the first time since everything had started, Jake felt hope. They had the artifact. They had survived, and they would keep fighting, together.